Winston Churchill had seen it all. 5 years of war, Dunkirk, the Blitz, El Alamein. He'd worked with every Allied general, assessed their strengths and weaknesses, and formed opinions about American military capability. Then he met George S. Patton, and every assumption Churchill held about American generals shattered. Patton didn't behave like other Allied commanders. He didn't defer to British experience. He didn't accept limitations or follow protocols. Churchill watched, often with horror, sometimes with admiration, as this theatrical American general did things no one expected, things that changed the war and challenged everything Churchill thought he knew about American forces. Today, we're revealing 15 things Patton did that left Britain's Prime Minister absolutely stunned. Number 9 made Churchill question whether Patton was brilliant or insane. Let's begin. Number 15. Slap soldiers and keep his command. Churchill, like most British officials, heard about the slapping incidents in Sicily where Patton physically assaulted soldiers suffering from combat fatigue. In Britain's class-conscious military, such behavior by an officer toward enlisted men would have meant immediate relief from command, possible court-martial, and certainly the end of a military career. Churchill expected, indeed assumed, that Patton would be sent home in disgrace. When Eisenhower instead gave Patton a reprimand but kept him in command, Churchill was genuinely surprised. He questioned Eisenhower's decision, asking whether Americans understood military discipline. Eisenhower explained that Patton was too valuable to lose, that his battlefield capabilities outweighed his personal failings. Churchill, pragmatist that he was, eventually understood the calculation but never quite accepted it. In his view, there were principles that mattered more than tactical genius, though he admitted privately that Britain's own generals lacked anyone with Patton's aggressive capabilities. Number 14. Move an entire army 90 degrees in a blizzard December 1944. When Churchill learned that Patton had promised to pivot 3 divisions and attack north toward Bastogne in 48 hours, his first response was to check if the report was accurate. Surely no general would make such a promise. When confirmed, Churchill told his staff, "Either Patton is mad, or he's the finest operational commander of this war. We shall know in 2 days which." When Patton actually delivered, Churchill was forced to revise every assessment he'd made about American operational capability. British generals had told Churchill that Americans, while brave, lacked the staff work and coordination for complex maneuvers. Patton had just executed something even British forces would consider impossible. Churchill sent a private message to Eisenhower. Patton's relief of Bastogne represents the kind of operational audacity we British have been missing since 1940. Congratulations on having such a commander, even if he is difficult. Number 13. Publicly criticize Allied strategy. British military protocol meant officers never publicly criticized strategy or questioned command decisions. Patton ignored this completely. He made statements to press about Allied strategy being too cautious, criticized the decision to halt at certain points, and openly disagreed with operational choices made by Supreme Command. Churchill, who valued unity of command and public solidarity, was appalled. He complained to Roosevelt that Patton was undermining Allied cohesion and needed to be controlled. Roosevelt's response, that Americans valued frank speaking and Patton's opinions reflected aggressive spirit, baffled Churchill. In Britain's system, such insubordination would be crushed immediately. That Americans tolerated it suggested a fundamentally different military culture Churchill struggled to understand. Number 12. Race Montgomery to Messina. Churchill had approved the Sicily plan that gave Montgomery operational priority, with American forces in support. When reports arrived that Patton was racing Montgomery to Messina, Churchill's reaction mixed amusement and concern. He admired competitive spirit but worried about Allied unity. When Patton actually beat Montgomery to the objective, Churchill faced an awkward situation, congratulating Americans on their success while consoling Britain's most celebrated field marshal on his humiliation. Churchill's private assessment, recorded in his diary. Patton embarrassed Montgomery at Messina, but perhaps Montgomery needed embarrassing. British forces have become too methodical, too cautious. This American cowboy, theatrical as he is, understands that wars are won through speed and aggression, not careful planning alone. I wish we had a British general with half of Patton's audacity. Number 11. Advocate for arming Germans against Soviets. By spring 1945, Churchill was deeply concerned about Soviet intentions in Europe. He'd been trying to get American leaders to recognize the Soviet threat. Then Patton, of all people, began publicly advocating for keeping German units intact and possibly rearming them to fight the Soviets. Churchill was simultaneously pleased someone agreed with his assessment of the Soviet threat and horrified that Patton said it so bluntly in public. Churchill tried to use Patton's statements to push Roosevelt and later Truman toward his own anti-Soviet position. But Patton's crude language and lack of diplomatic nuance actually made Churchill's own more carefully worded concerns seem extreme by association. Churchill wanted Western leaders to plan for Soviet containment. Patton wanted to fight them immediately. The difference left Churchill in the strange position of having to distance himself from an ally who agreed with him. Number 10. Ignore supply limitations. Churchill, having managed Britain's war economy for 5 years, understood logistics. Modern armies moved on supply lines. When Churchill learned that Patton was advancing across France despite fuel shortages, ignoring orders to halt for resupply, his reaction was, either the American supply system is far better than we've been told, or Patton is conducting operations that will end in disaster. When Third Army continued advancing successfully despite supply constraints, Churchill demanded to know how. British generals couldn't explain it. Patton's supply officers were scrounging, appropriating, and improvising at levels British quartermasters considered impossible. Churchill began to suspect that American logistical flexibility was a significant military advantage Britain lacked. Patton proved you could fight effectively on insufficient supplies if you moved fast enough that the enemy couldn't exploit your vulnerability. Number 9. Cross the Rhine before Montgomery's elaborate operation. Churchill had approved and publicly supported Montgomery's Operation Plunder, the carefully planned set-piece crossing of the Rhine with massive artillery, airborne drops, and overwhelming force. Churchill planned to observe the operation personally as a demonstration of British military capability. Then Patton quietly crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim before Montgomery's operation even launched. Churchill, who'd been preparing speeches about British operational excellence, had to hastily revise them to acknowledge that Americans had crossed first. His private reaction, recorded by his secretary, Patton has made Montgomery look like a slow, over-careful schoolmaster compared to a daring student who solves the problem while the teacher is still writing on the blackboard. This is either brilliant opportunism or reckless risk-taking. Given that it succeeded, I suppose we must call it brilliant. Churchill visited both crossing sites. At Montgomery's, he witnessed the elaborate operation he'd endorsed. At Patton's crossing point, he saw evidence of hasty, improvised assault that had worked despite violating every principle of careful planning Churchill valued. He reportedly told his staff, "I'm beginning to understand why Americans won their independence from us. They simply don't believe in doing things properly, and somehow it works." Number 8. Express contempt for British caution. Patton made no secret of his opinion that British forces were too slow, too cautious, too concerned with minimizing casualties at the expense of operational tempo. When these comments reached Churchill, he was torn between offense at criticism of British forces and recognition that Patton had a point. Churchill had spent the entire war pushing his own generals to be more aggressive, to take more risks, to stop being so careful. Now an American general was publicly saying what Churchill had said privately for years. Churchill couldn't decide if Patton was a useful critic exposing real British military problems, or an arrogant American who didn't understand that Britain had been fighting since 1939 and had learned caution through bitter experience. Number 7. Achieve better results than British generals. This was perhaps the most unexpected and uncomfortable reality for Churchill. Patton's Third Army consistently outperformed British forces by nearly every metric: advance rate, territory liberated, prisoners captured, casualties per mile advanced. Churchill had assumed British military experience would translate to superior performance. Instead, this aggressive American, in command for less time than most British generals, was achieving better results. Churchill couldn't publicly acknowledge this without undermining British military prestige, but privately he admitted to his war cabinet that Patton demonstrated qualities British generals lacked. Churchill began pushing his own commanders to study Patton's methods and adopt more aggressive approaches. The fact that Britain's Prime Minister was telling British generals to learn from an American showed how completely Patton had exceeded expectations. Number 6. Maintain morale despite controversies. Churchill expected that Patton's multiple controversies, slapping incidents, insubordination, inflammatory statements, would destroy his credibility with soldiers. British officers who behaved similarly would lose their troops' confidence. Instead, Patton's soldiers loved him. His Third Army had exceptional morale, low desertion rates, and high re-enlistment. Churchill couldn't understand it. British liaison officers reported that American soldiers forgave Patton's flaws because they trusted his tactical competence and believed he cared about their lives by fighting aggressively rather than cautiously. This contradicted everything Churchill understood about military leadership, that officers maintained authority through proper behavior and strict discipline. Patton maintained authority through results, and his soldiers respected that more than proper behavior. Number 5. Predict Soviet intentions accurately. Churchill had been warning about Soviet expansionism since 1944. Most Allied leaders dismissed his concerns as anti-communist paranoia. Patton, independently, reached the same conclusions and expressed them even more bluntly. Churchill was surprised to find his most vocal supporter of anti-Soviet policy was this controversial American general, whom most people dismissed as a simple warrior. Churchill attempted to coordinate with Patton on pushing for harder lines against Soviet demands. But Patton's lack of diplomatic sophistication and tendency to make inflammatory public statements actually undermined Churchill's more carefully crafted arguments. Churchill found himself in the ironic position of having to distance himself from someone who agreed with him, because Patton's methods were counterproductive to Churchill's goals. Number 4. Earn respect from German commanders. Churchill read German intelligence reports and post-war interrogations showing that German commanders feared and respected Patton more than any other Allied general, including Montgomery, who'd actually defeated Rommel at El Alamein. This was unexpected and somewhat embarrassing for Churchill, who'd promoted Montgomery as Britain's answer to German tactical excellence. German generals, when asked about Allied commanders, consistently called Patton the most dangerous. They praised his operational tempo, his aggressive tactics, and his understanding of mobile warfare. Churchill realized that if Germans, who'd pioneered modern armored warfare, acknowledged Patton's superiority, then perhaps British assessments of American military capability needed serious revision. Number 3. Refused to accept American inferiority. British military culture in 1942-43 assumed British forces were superior to American forces due to experience. Most American generals seemed to accept this and deferred to British expertise. Patton refused completely. He never accepted that Americans needed to learn from British example, that British methods were superior, or that American forces should play supporting roles. Churchill initially found this arrogance offensive, but as Patton proved his methods worked, Churchill began to appreciate that Patton's refusal to accept inferiority had actually pushed American forces to excel. British generals, comfortable in their assumption of superiority, had perhaps become complacent. Patton's aggressive competitiveness had forced everyone, British included, to perform better. Number 2. Become more famous than Montgomery. By 1945, George S. Patton was more famous worldwide than Bernard Montgomery. This shocked Churchill, who'd carefully cultivated Montgomery's image as Britain's great general. Montgomery had defeated Rommel, planned D-Day's ground assault, and commanded throughout Northwest Europe. Yet Patton's theatrical personality, his dramatic operations, and his quotable statements made him the more celebrated figure. Churchill understood publicity and understood that Patton had mastered modern media in ways Montgomery never could. But it stung British pride that America's most famous general overshadowed Britain's most successful field commander. Churchill tried to promote Montgomery's achievements but couldn't compete with Patton's natural showmanship. Number 1. Prove American military equality. The most unexpected thing Patton did was comprehensively prove that American forces were not junior partners learning from British experience, but equals, and in some ways superiors, to British forces. Churchill had entered the war assuming Britain would lead the Western Alliance militarily. By 1945, it was clear American forces under commanders like Patton had not just caught up, but had in many ways surpassed British operational excellence. Churchill's post-war writings show him wrestling with this reality. He'd wanted American material support with British military leadership. Instead, American military competence, embodied in generals like Patton, meant Britain had to accept genuine partnership rather than leadership. Patton, more than any other single commander, demonstrated that Americans could plan, execute and win battles as well as any European army. For Churchill, who'd built his career on British imperial superiority, this was the most unexpected outcome of all. Churchill's final assessment of Patton, written in his war memoirs. General Patton was perhaps the most controversial Allied commander, certainly the most theatrical, and possibly the most effective. He proved that American forces possessed not just material superiority, but operational excellence equal to any army in history. Whether this was entirely comfortable for Britain to accept is another question, but it was undeniably true. Churchill began the war expecting to guide inexperienced American forces. He ended it acknowledging that American generals like Patton had achieved excellence Britain's own commanders struggled to match. If this story of how one controversial general exceeded every expectation and changed British perceptions of American capability fascinated you, subscribe to this channel now. We're bringing you the untold perspectives, the uncomfortable truths, and the moments that challenged assumptions about who the real military powers were. Hit that notification bell, drop a comment about Churchill and Patton's complex relationship, and share this video with anyone who appreciates history that goes beyond simple narratives. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the most unexpected outcomes teach us the most important lessons.